What is your first memory of having stolen something? And maybe also, do you remember how it felt? I'm still a little ashamed to retell the story even now, about 40 years after it happened. But for myself, I was in what we called Class 1, the equivalent of P1, and a boy called Fernando had brought a whole lot of round yellow stickers to school, and he had shared them with a select group of people. In fact, if I remember correctly, he shared them, I think, mostly with the girls in the class. Um, and there was quite an excited buzz amongst those who received these small rolls of round yellow dot stickers. Thinking back, I felt left out. And at the time, all of our school bags and school cases were kept outside the classroom. And so, pretending to need something from my own suitcase, I asked to go outside to fetch it. But instead, I found Fernando's case. I opened it and I took some of the yellow dot stickers for myself, and I hid them in my own case. Wendy shared with me that the first time she remembers stealing anything was also when she stole Quentin Bean's rubber when she was age 6, also in the equivalent of P1. She said that his eraser had a picture of a mouse on it, and she had a kind of a plain old eraser, and she felt jealous, and so she stole it from him. It's interesting reflecting back on the experience. I remember not feeling very nice about what I had done. A little like a dark cloud had settled over me. And the feeling just grew worse when Fernando told the teacher that some of his stickers had been stolen. I hate to confess it, but I never owned up, and continued to see those wretched yellow stickers for years to come every time I came across them stashed away in my bottom drawer at home, along with all sorts of other useless odds and ends. Looking back, I think that was probably the last time that I can remember blatantly and unambiguously taking something that didn't belong to me, which I knew belonged to somebody else. The lesson was in the experience of what it felt like. It was not an experience that I wanted to repeat. It's not to say that since then there haven't been more ambiguous moments when things have felt a little more grey, or where I've put my own self-interest above others, where the lines have felt a little bit more blurred. I certainly can't claim to have lived like a saint my whole life since that incident. What is also interesting, looking back at the incident when I was age 6 in P1, was that sense of being left out. It was that sense of having been excluded from quite a large group of others. And there was that was a sense of a defining, motivating factor in what I did. It's interesting because it's a fairly well-known statistic that those societies that have the greatest gap between rich and poor also experience the greatest levels of crime, ranging from petty theft to far more serious organized crime. It makes me wonder to what extent at least some of that crime stems from a deep sense of being excluded, being left out from the economic spoils that they see others enjoying in abundance. I've seen it suggested on a number of occasions that theft and crime cannot be solved by policing alone, but also needs to be solved somehow by creating more equitable societies, making sure that fewer people feel like they have been excluded and left out and sidelined from the economic life of society. I think it's going to be a challenge, certainly here in the UK going forward, with greater levels of inequality as a result of COVID. Today we come to examine the 8th of the 10 Commandments, and as I uh, look at those words of the commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," I certainly hope that Wendy and I are not the only ones with memories of having stolen something when we were younger. I imagine that we all have a memory, a similar memory. It's a reminder that stealing is, in fact, quite a universal experience, except in exceptional cases. I would hazard a guess that almost all children need in some way to be taught not to steal. Except in exceptional instances, most children need to be encouraged to share and not simply to take things that don't belong to them. It would seem that we almost all have a default self-centered mode of being when we are born into this world. It's quite natural for little babies to have a sense that the whole world revolves around them and their needs and wants, and therefore the tendency to take things and to want to claim things as their own, even if they belong to someone else. Wendy and I can see the same thing playing out with our two cats. George is the bed king. He has a tendency to assume that any of the cat beds that he finds belongs to him, even if we have made it especially for Annie, knowing full well that George already has the best bed in the house. The same is true of morning treats. We have to watch George with a hawk eye because he has a tendency to wolf down his own morning treat, and when he is finished, he will assume that he has quite innocently that he has the right to go on and finish Annie's treat as well. If we are honest with ourselves, most of us, except the very saintly, would have to admit that even when we have been trained in the basics of not taking what is not ours, there often remains a centrifugal tendency to want to receive and get as much as we can, rather than to give and share. In exploring and critically reflecting on the Ten Commandments in the wider context of the Old Testament, Michael Nugent is of the opinion that none of the Ten Commandments were originally conceived of or understood to be laying down universal laws or values of right and wrong. Rather, he asserts that these were originally tribal laws. According to Nugent, all the commandments, including the commandment not to steal, were about protecting the stability and the interests of one tribe, the Israelites. And so the commandment, the eighth commandment not to steal, he suggests, was a directive not to steal that only applied to internal relationships within the people of Israel. Now, there is much within the Old Testament that can be used to support this view. In the book of Deuteronomy, for example, the God character through Moses encourages the Israelites to steal the treasures, animals, women, and children of enemy tribes. Michael Nugent also points out that the Israelites also stole the land of other tribes. Their God, as the story is told them to drive out all the inhabitants, to take possession of the land and to settle in it and divide it up according to their own clans. While it is clear that this injunction not to steal was originally not conceived of as a universal law within the minds of most Israelites, it was at least a start in the moral development of a rather rough and often brutal early Israelite people. One could say that in the school of growing to full ethical maturity, we all need to start somewhere. For the Israelite people, their starting point was within their own tribe or nation. Even though the early Israelites may not have conceived of this law as being of universal applicability, I believe that the seed of universal applicability is surely contained within it. In fact, the universal nature of the law or the commandment not to steal can be seen in the fact that such laws and injunctions are not unique to the Ten Commandments, or the Old Testament. Values and laws against stealing can be found within all the major religions of the world, in Islam, in Hinduism, Sikhism, and Buddhism. For example, in the 10 precepts of Buddhism, the second precept is the precept not to steal. In fact, it's worded slightly differently from the commandment not to steal. It's rather understood as to abstain from taking what is not given. Clearly, the sentiment, however, is the same. In fact, my own reflections on the religions of the world, in those reflections, I have to admit that I found great value in a Buddhist approach to matters of morality, which I believe are complementary to a deeper and more nuanced Christian approach and reflection. The Buddha, who only ever conceived of himself as a human being who had awoken to the true nature of reality, approached matters of morality primarily from the point of view of suffering, and the endeavor to navigate a path that would reduce suffering, not only for the one on the spiritual path, but also for others and the rest of society. From a Buddhist perspective, the injunction or the precept not to steal is understood to be important because it reduces suffering. A Buddhist approach to morality would say that you can test these things for yourself, steal something, and reflect on what it feels like, and you will find that it is not a pathway that leads to spiritual freedom or wholeness. This was my own and Wendy's experience as 6-year-olds, and to a large extent, it has lived with me ever since. And so if you want to be psychologically and spiritually free, and to be in touch with a natural and deep sense of happiness and well-being, then these will not be achieved by theft, robbery, or deception, which will always leave you feeling cut off from others and more isolated in the prison of oneself. Freedom and joy come from feeling connected with others and with life. Stealing and taking, and even keeping and hoarding, undermine that deeper sense of connectedness, which we in the Christian tradition describe with the word love. And so I believe that the Buddha might have been in complete agreement with the sentiment expressed poetically in Psalm 84 verse 10. Better is one day in your courts than 1,000 elsewhere. I would rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of the wicked. In the psalm, being in the courts of God can symbolize the heart that is open and free and at ease, feeling at one and in harmony with the natural goodness of being alive. Being in the tents of the wicked symbolizes being caught up in the prison of the deceptive and manipulative self. In closing, the opposite of stealing is surely generosity. Whereas stealing is inward-looking and self-orientated, looking out for number one, then generosity is about being outward-looking, wishing to reach out to others in acts of care, kindness, and blessing. I started the sermon by asking if you can remember the first time you stole something and what that felt like. I'd like to close the sermon by asking you to remember your most recent act of generosity. Who did you give to? How did it make you feel? How did that feeling compare with the feeling of your first memory of having stolen something? And so may we all come to know more and more the inner freedom, openness, joy, and happiness that comes as we make the shift over and over again from a life of kind of self-centeredness, centered on ourselves, a life of taking, of getting, and even of hoarding and keeping, to a life of generosity, of giving and blessing. And in doing so, may we discover the Spirit of God, the Spirit of joy welling up from within us. Amen.